Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our 4-part video series on attachment styles and healing the inner child. I'm excited to be here with you today. The way this works is I'm going to deliver our topic for this video segment, and then once we complete that part of the process, then I'll switch over to answer some Q&A. And you're welcome to offer some questions in the chat as we go through our topics for today. So, upon arriving to the world of self-help and personal development, many of us get there by way of difficult romantic relationships, painful childhood experiences. Maybe there's career burnout or confusion. Maybe you have health concerns or a host of other difficult circumstances in your life. And so by the time we arrive at this world of self-help and personal development, we're usually at a stage where we have stopped trying to satisfy a feeling just because we're having it. And instead, we're starting to take a pause and reflect on, why am I feeling that way? And so it's that simple little question, why, that can often send us on a completely different direction in life, preferably one that we would rather be taking. And so for members of my online community, the motivation typically stems from love rejected, love lost, unrequited love, and even smothering love. And so one of the first things we can learn is that the love you experience between you and a partner is often a reflection of the love that exists between you and you. And so John Bradshaw popularized a helpful way of thinking about this, which is learning to love yourself by loving your wounded inner child. Now, internal family systems theory, IFS, built upon this concept by introducing the idea that you also have other characters living in your unconscious mind that protect and manage how well you can access that inner child. And so this 4-part video series, we're going to be focusing on the following topics. Number 1, the impact of the inner child on your attachment style and how it's going to play out in your adult relationships. Number 2, an experiential art activity to explore the presence of other parts, such as an inner critic, through the framework of IFS. A guided meditation to connect to your inner child. And in the end, we're also going to have a hot seat interview with a lovely volunteer who shares her experience of dialoguing with her parts to reduce dating anxiety as a single mom. And so today we're going to start off by looking at the impact of the inner child on your attachment style and how that plays itself out in adult relationships. And so this includes a definition for attachment styles, a definition for the inner child. We're going to look at 2 case examples of how the inner child affects attachment styles in adulthood, and a brief introduction to the other parts that exist in your subconscious mind. Now, before we dive into it, if you are new to my online community, welcome. My name is Brianamacwilliam, and I'm a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist with more than 15 years in the field, helping adults struggling with insecure attachment go from self-doubting to self-sovereign so they can attract and cultivate the secure relationships that they want. And I do this using my trademark method, which assumes a trauma-informed somatic approach to healing attachment styles, specifically in a spiritual framework. Now, if you like what you see and hear today, I invite you to like, subscribe, or follow me for more. We're going to be talking a lot more about related topics, and I take all comments and into consideration when coming up with video series like these. And so with that, let's just dive right into our topic for today's video segment. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is, what are attachment styles? Okay, well, to begin, let's just define it. So attachment styles are patterns of behavior that develop in childhood, typically as a result of the interactions with our primary caregivers. And so these patterns of behavior carry over into adulthood, and they influence how we relate to others and how we cope with stress and other emotional changes. So there are 4 main attachment styles. There is secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, which is sometimes called fearful avoidant. So secure attachment is characterized by trust, comfort with intimacy, and interdependent relationships. There's a sense of personal autonomy and a positive self-image. Then we have our anxious folks, and I call these individuals open hearts. And anxious attachment typically involves a fear of abandonment, a need for a lot of closeness and reassurance and love, and oftentimes with a strong need for approval or validation. Then we have our more dismissive, avoidant, what I call rolling stones. And these folks usually need more distance in their relationships. They tend to avoid too much emotional intimacy because they are protecting themselves from fears of failure, inadequacy, vulnerability, or feeling trapped or smothered in relationships. It usually includes difficulty recognizing or connecting to their deeper emotions as well. Then we have our disorganized or fearfully avoidant, what I call spice of lifers. And these individuals can display both avoidant and anxious tendencies, wanting love while also being afraid of it. And they can be predictably unpredictable. Sometimes they have ambivalent or mixed signals in communication and difficulties with soothing others or accepting soothing for themselves. So they may also experience symptoms of what's called dysfunctional dissociation, sort of numbing out or feeling disembodied from their experience. And this is typically the result of severe trauma. Okay. So when you struggle with an insecure attachment style, it could be said that your inner child and its unmet needs are compelling you from behind the scenes in your unconscious emotional memory. So that is what I would like to talk about next. All right, so what is the inner child and why does it matter for our adult relationships? So, the inner child is a concept developed to help us understand how our experiences as a child tend to shape our outlook in life and specifically in our relationships. The idea was popularized by the work of psychologist and author John Bradshaw, who viewed our inner child as the source of what he called woundedness. So, the limitations and the resistances within each of us that can prevent us from attaining a loving and fulfilling relationship in our adulthood. But in understanding what our inner child needs, it provides us with valuable insight into what we're seeking in our relationships, and it helps us contextualize the way that our own attachment styles have developed. So, for example, if we experienced neglect as a child, we may develop an anxious attachment style as a way to seek reassurance and attention from other people. Alternatively, if we experienced abuse, we may develop more of a dismissive, avoidant, or fearful avoidant attachment style as a way to protect ourselves from future harm or pain or rejection or unmet needs. So, for instance, let's say we have Jane. And Jane is a 40-year-old heterosexual woman who has difficulty forming meaningful relationships with others. But after exploring the roots of her issues in therapy, she comes to understand that her anxious attachment style in adulthood has been shaped by her relationship to her mother, who was distant and lacked emotional connection, leaving Jane feeling lonely and unfulfilled through much of her childhood. By understanding the needs of her inner child for affection, for security, for just full presence in her mother's relationship, Jane came to realize that she pursued emotionally unavailable partners because they mirrored that emotional unavailability in her mother. And so deep down, her inner child felt that if she could get these distant partners to love her, then she could finally prove herself and truly believe deep down that she was lovable. But while Jane would sacrifice herself and her emotional needs in this kind of relentless pursuit of an unavailable partner, her own inner child was relentlessly in pursuit of Jane's loving regard and affection. Yet Jane was in the habit of beating her inner child up for being too needy or burdensome or dramatic or demanding, all of which were internalized messages that she'd received from her mother and were now playing themselves out in her adult relationships. Okay, so that leads us to the next topic. So, what is the impact of unresolved inner child issues on those adult relationships? So, when our inner child is neglected, it can have a profound effect on how we interact in our relationships as adults. It can lead us to seek out unhealthy attachment situations or develop coping mechanisms such as avoidance in favor of being in control, right? And if we don't make an effort to address those issues, then sometimes we can wind up creating the very things that we are afraid of. And that can lead to increased feelings of insecurity and anxiety. Okay. Now, on the other hand, When we make an effort to heal our inner child's wounding, it can open up possibilities for more fulfilling connections with others. We can begin to recognize our attachment style and learn how to shift it if necessary. We can also become more aware of our emotional triggers, which usually point to unmet emotional needs. And that allows us to develop the capacity to be vulnerable in relationships, which is essential for creating meaningful connections with other people. So, for example, maybe Tim and his inner child are in agreement that he wants love in his life. So he meets Jane and they get into a relationship. But when Tim was younger, he learned that to be safe in love, you had to make yourself scarce and not need too much because his parents were stressed out all the time and made him feel like a burden to them, much like Jane. So in his adult relationships, when Jane becomes emotionally upset, right, or requires something from him, instead of hashing it out with her, he makes himself scarce so as not to burden her because he assumes, well, I must be the problem. And so Tim demonstrates more emotionally avoidant behavior. But when Jane wants more of Tim's attention, but we know now that Jane wants more of Tim's attention and not less. So when he behaves this way, she gets fed up, she feels abandoned, like he doesn't care, and views it as a repetition of her relationship with her mother. And so eventually, Jane ends the relationship, and Tim just doesn't really understand why. So in this case, it would also be Tim's wounded inner child compelling his responses to conflict in love. And because he's so identified with the feelings and the emotions and the perspective of that younger version of himself, when his inner child is stimulated, he's not able to differentiate the influence of that child from the resources of his more mature and sophisticated adult mind at what it is capable of doing, right? So, for example, maybe at work, logically, Tim can look at a problem, assess his resources, and address conflicts directly with coworkers using his mental and emotional maturity. But when it comes to love, he turns into a shrinking violet and makes himself scarce. So these resources disappear because love is an aspect of life that triggers his wounded inner child to take over. Okay. Because attachment styles affect us on how we think, how we feel, and how we respond. Okay. So learning to integrate that inner child, however, would lead to increased emotional flexibility and maturity, as well as that expanded mental maturity, right? So what would that look like? Well, for example, Tim's inner child carries a powerful emotional energy that compels him to think something like the following: I'm such a failure. Nobody loves me for who I am, only for what I do for them. I have to earn my way or stay out of people's way. People think I'm a burden and they reject me. I'm not wanted. If someone's unhappy, it's my fault and I should just leave them alone. I ruin everything, right? So just give me a little comment there or like if this sounds familiar to you. But if Tim could create some spaciousness around the feelings and the emotional energy that is stimulated and tied to these thoughts, he might be able to employ a more objective and conscientious perspective. And that might sound like this: I'm very successful and I'm fully capable of contributing to any relationship that I commit myself to. My partner wants me in their life and they frequently extend invitations for me to participate in their enjoyment and pleasure. When my partner expresses upset feelings, it's because they are wanting to connect with me again, and they're trying to teach me how to do that with them more effectively. If I can sit with the discomfort long enough, I'm fully capable of finding co-creative solutions, ones that can actually deepen our intimacy and connection. Right? So let me know in the comments if that's landing with you. Now, in Jane's case, on the other side of this, she has a negative internal narrative that typically sounds like, I'm not worthy of love, and I'm either too much, too intense, or not enough. And nobody validates my feelings or helps me when I'm struggling. They're just going to abandon me if I need too much. But I have to work hard to initiate everything because if I don't push hard enough, then I never get anything, right? But if Jane could create some spaciousness around those feelings and the emotional energy that is tied to and stimulates these thoughts, she might be able to employ her more objective and conscientious perspective. And that might sound like this. Well, just because I may not be able to meet my connection needs with one person doesn't mean my needs are a burden or cannot be met with someone better suited for me. While I choose to commit my romantic energies to someone that is generously validating of my experience, I know my worth and opinions are not invalid if they don't. As I become increasingly self aware, my understanding of boundaries grow, and I'm better to discern which needs can be met in relationship and which needs are issues that I must process for myself. I don't need to work hard for the affection and the acknowledgement of a lover. In fact, all I need to do is relax and extend the invitation. Those that are meant for me will accept and reciprocate my efforts. Right? So just let me know a little like or a thumbs up if that resonates with you. So, to arrive at this level of awareness and truly begin to integrate the different aspects of ourselves, we would need to connect to the essence of our being, right? And this is something that is independent from these parts or from the inner child. And I like to call this your spiritual self, your spiritual core self, the essence of your being. Right? And once we can connect to that part, now we go about unburdening the inner child and the other aspects of ourselves. Now, what are these different aspects, and is there more than one inner child? Well, let's talk about that next. Now, indeed, there is, in fact. Therapist and author John Bradshaw suggests that we have at least one wounded inner child at every phase of development. But there's more than inner children running around pulling the strings in our unconscious. There are also other characters playing important roles, trying to keep these children in line. So, for example, one of the main tenets of internal family systems theory, IFS, developed by Robert Schwartz, is that we are all made up of different parts or subpersonalities. So this is not the same as dissociative identity disorder, in which you have multiple primary personalities. Instead, this is more you have one primary personality with various contributing voices. And so these parts can be thought of as kind of like mini versions of ourselves that exist at different developmental stages, and they have different functions. So they can create some resistance to change if they're not fully acknowledged or integrated into a full concept of ourselves. Okay. So how do we recognize this resistance? Well, when you have struggled and have gained a lot of insight in the realms of personal development, but feel as though you are still stuck in your progress, or you still see repetitive patterns in your relationship, or you don't feel any differently, even though you might be thinking differently, then it's likely that a few of these powerful but unconscious characters are at odds with each other. Okay. Now, to learn more, I would invite you to like this video and follow along and come back for our next installment next Monday. Because in the next segment, we are going to explore more in depth the different parts that exist in addition to the wounded inner child. And we're going to help you evaluate how effective these parts might be in affecting your growth and healing. And so before I transition and sign off here, I would love it if you would let me know in the comments there below, how have you heard of the wounded inner child before? And how do you think it shows up in your life and relationships? So I look forward to learning much more about your experience as we continue throughout these series. I appreciate your willingness to watch, and stay tuned for the next installment. And for those of you that are able to stick around, I invite you to hang out with me for a few minutes. I'd like to see if I can answer some Q&A. I'm going to pull up my chat here and see who's with me. All right. I see some highs. I see some thumbs up. Okay, great. Let's see. So one of the questions I sometimes receive is, what happens when your inner child doesn't want to speak to you, right? Well, when the inner child doesn't want to speak to you, it's usually because we must consider that for a very long time, we haven't really been listening to it, right? Or we haven't really been caring for it. And if we've been beating ourselves up or telling ourselves a negative story, then we haven't created a safe place. We haven't created a safe space for that child to show up and talk to us, right? So oftentimes, if the child is unwilling to speak to you, it's usually that there is another part stepping in to protect that child, or to manage that child, or to distance, douse, distract you from the feelings that that child is holding. And so if you want to make some kind of progress on the level of emotional development, or feel changes, not just know how to change, then it's going to require being in conversation with those managing parts, so that you are able to learn how to mitigate the effect of those emotions that the inner child carries and is going to bring to you, because the child doesn't trust you yet, right? So we have to build that trust over time. Yes, I've heard before, when I react a certain way, how can we do when we feel flooded, overwhelmed, so on and so forth. So when we are feeling flooded, this is a mobilization of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is connected to our limbic brain. And these are the parts of the body that respond to connection and attachments in relationships. So when you're feeling flooded, there's some part of what you are interpreting on a body level, and then in addition, a mental level, there's something you're interpreting in your experience as threatening. So the sympathetic nervous system turns on. The hippocampus in your limbic brain, which tags information, letting us know what it is in a more organized fashion, turns off because our amygdala, which is the alarm bell of the body, turns on, and it gets really loud. And the hippocampus says, "Whoop, I better tuck my tags away and get ready to run," right? So this is either fly away, fight, or flight, right? So fly away, fight to defend myself. So usually it's fly away, push away, or fight, right? So the sympathetic nervous system turns on, mobilizes, and decides based on your temperament, based on the context in which you exist, based on what are the messages you're receiving in your environment. What's the best thing to do here? Is it to avoid and fly away? Is it to fight for? Is it to push away? Right? So this is all requires some kind of activation of your body and of your system. And so there's this big feeling that comes up, and we call it overwhelm, right? We call it reactive, what have you. But usually this is because we did not receive enough, let's say, training or modeling when we were younger for understanding boundaries. Because boundaries allow us to tease out the subtleties of experience. So if you could imagine an overwhelmed feeling, let's say a triggered feeling, is actually pointing you to an unmet need. So when we haven't been trained on how to recognize the subtleties of the emotional energy moving through our body, to identify them, name them, and accurately categorize them, then it becomes a big overwhelming feeling, and we call it bad, right? And we push, run, or fight something because we just think it bad comes up. Danger, 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 right? We're not able to sift and sort through the subtleties of experience, which is why when we're insecure, we usually have very strong black and white thinking. You're with me, you're against me, right? You're my enemy, or you're my friend, but you're a lover, but there's no in between, right? Often why we struggle to have friendships, because you're either totally with me or you're not, right? So this makes it hard to have friends, because friendships in and of themselves are kind of a different kind of way of relating, right? It's so the question is, how do we find our way through that? Well, it requires developing a more robust emotional vocabulary. Well, how do you do that? Well, that is what my online programs are really all about, right? We look at clarifying desire. What is it that we are wanting? Then we look at what are all the narratives that are coming up when I actually identify and accurately name and claim what it is that I want and need. Now we've got all the noise come up that says you can't have it for this reason or that reason, right? Now, all that noise, those are those parts letting us know that they're there. And now they're like, you want that? Okay, here we are. You got to deal with us first. You got to process us first so we can make room for that, right? So that usually involves, number one, cognitive reframing, being aware of the meaning you are making of things, which is usually erroneous. It's usually tied to a past experience that doesn't exist anymore, okay? Then we have to look at what energy has constellated around those thoughts. And where does that live in the landscape of your body? Literally in your muscular and your sinews, right? So now we work with energy work and embodied practices that are going to help you tap into that on the embodied level. So talking about cognitive reframing is going to help us create spaciousness around the emotion that we're having, but then we have to work with the emotion directly on the body level, right? So this is what we call using top down and bottom up processes to make sure that we are integrating mind, body, and I argue spirit. Okay. So then we come up with new reframes, we come up with new thoughts, new ways of thinking and being, and we now use the body to install them, right? We've created all this space, we've released all these constrictions in the mind and body. Now we're going to create something new to put in there. And now we're going to embody that, right? And of course, the best way to do this is through the way that you were originally intended, which is through playfulness, curiosity, creativity, the way that children do when they are in optimal environments, right? We have to bring our inner children, we have to reparent them, as it is often referred to, okay? And over time, as you start to push up against the threshold of that overwhelmed feeling, you start sifting and sorting through, oh, it's not overwhelm. It's actually two feelings I'm having at once. It's anticipation, but also nervousness. It is enjoyment with a little bit of fear. It is happy, but also a bit doubtful, right? So once we start to tease out the subtleties of those emotional experiences, overwhelm loses its fuel because it's not overwhelming. It's organized now. You understand what's going on, right? And you can choose which thread you want to grab hold of and pull in your experience, right? Does this also happen in trauma bonds? Then it feels as being in love. So this depends on how we are defining love. And if we have been in, let's say, charged environments, charged emotional environments where there was not a real understanding of what it means to have an autonomous self, then when we meet someone else who also doesn't understand what it means to have an autonomous self, we tend to merge with them very quickly, right? But because of that, we now perceive them as an extension of ourselves, and that feels like feels like synchronicity, right? And then what happens is over time, some of the same stories and reenactments start to occur, right? And now we call it not just bonding, we call it trauma bonding, because we are bringing into it all of the things that we're hoping to relive in order to revise with this person. Now, I am someone who likes to approach these things from a spiritual perspective, and I might argue, a lot of people feel like these things are predestined. Well, there's a lot of adrenaline going on, adrenaline, dopamine, oxytocin going on in there. That's probably going to create that euphoric feeling. If it's someone who's inconsistent and if they don't understand boundaries or have personal autonomy, they are likely to be inconsistent. So now they are creating what's called frustration attraction. And that is because you're receiving intermittent reinforcement in the relationship and in the connection that you're experiencing. So that's going to ramp up your attachment chemicals. Okay, so there's the embodied experience of that. But then let's look at this from the spiritual angle, right? This is fated. They're my soulmate. I just know they're the one. So I don't believe that we exist in a world where any higher knowing being, collective consciousness would ever be so cruel as to give you 1 in a billion chances to meet someone that you could have a loving relationship with. I don't believe that. Okay. The other piece of it is if you were to meet a soulmate, and maybe these people are your soulmates, but we are misunderstanding the role of a soulmate. What would be the role of a soulmate? To connect you to your soul, right? So what is standing in the way of you being in consistent connection to your soul? All these ideas you have about worthiness and love, all these conditions you place on whether or not you can let yourself have it, whether or not you deserve it, whether or not it's out there for you. All of that is muck that is between you and your spirit. And so what happens? These trauma bonds, these soulmates come in, and what do? They kick it all up. They kick it all up. And there it is, right in front of your face. And now the universe says, here it is. You said you want deep love. get rid of this. Got to clean out your corners before it can move in, right? And so we think we get attached to that person and we think, oh, but they were the one. They were the one to show you what was in the way. Yeah. Maybe that can evolve into what I call an ascended partnership. Maybe. But sometimes they come in and they're delivering a message. And if you cling to the messenger, then the real gift can't show up, right? And if you ignore the messenger, then you're just going to get more messengers and they're just going to keep knocking harder and harder and harder. This is when we start to see repetitive patterns with new people, right? So I hope that makes sense. Thank you for these wonderful questions. I appreciate your attention and your engagement here today. I will be back next Monday, same time, same place. We're going to dig into the second segment of this video series, and we'll be answering some more questions. So I appreciate you showing up. Have a wonderful day.